Across the Queen City, inside executive boardrooms and high-tech startups. From research impacting the future of how we do business, to providing critical infrastructure to keep business moving and to keep workers safe. For more than 50 years, Business Niners have been at the forefront as doers, bold leaders, and change agents, driving business in Charlotte and beyond.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Troyer, Dean of the Belk College of Business at UNC Charlotte, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the UNC Charlotte Barings Economic Forecast today. So first, I want to take just a moment to thank Barings for a decade of support of the Belk College and the UNC Charlotte Barings Economic Forecast. So Barings is a global financial services firm with more than $354 billion in assets under management and over 2,000 associates. The firm's global headquarters are in Uptown Charlotte, and they maintain a strong international presence with offices throughout North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Under the Barings title sponsorship, the Barings UNC Charlotte Economic Forecast has flourished. The sponsorship has allowed us to fund the research and offer a written research report and this event at no charge to participants in the business community. So since 2010, attendance numbers have continued to rise. The program has extended its reach with even more so now as we've transitioned into a virtual format, with business and community leaders in Charlotte and across the state in attendance, and media coverage across the state. So this is a great example of how Charlotte's business community helps us fulfill our mission to serve the community as North Carolina's urban research business school. So we plan for the college's long-standing relationship with Barings to continue into the future, with their support going in a bit of a different direction. So thank you again to Barings for your continued support. So the UNC Charlotte Economic Forecast and this important research will continue, but we are looking for new sponsors. So today, the forecast presentation will be followed by an expanded Q&A. If you have questions, please submit them via chat at any time. We had so many questions last time that we're actually going to go a little bit longer today, about 15 minutes longer, to see if we can get all of your questions for John Connaughton answered. And for those of you on Twitter, you can join today's conversation by using hashtag #NCForecast. We look forward to seeing your tweets. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and our speaker, Dr. John Connaughton. John is the Barings Professor of Financial Economics in the Belk College of Business. John has served as the Director of the Economic Forecast since 1981. Each quarter, he interprets the data and shares his thoughts with us regarding where North Carolina's economy has been and where it's going next. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Connaughton.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's good to be here. Before we've got a big day today. First of all, I want to welcome all of you to the Barings UNC Charlotte Economic Forecast 2020 fourth quarter update. But before I begin, I'd like to echo Jennifer's thanking of Barings for sponsoring the last 10 years. It is the generous gifts that companies like Barings provide that allow us faculty to really be able to do the research that we find most rewarding and fulfilling. And it's been a pleasure to work with Barings over the past 10 years. And I just want to say thank you very much. You've made my life a little bit brighter by being able to do this kind of research. Anyway, today is the 9 months since we started back in March of 2011 with the coronavirus. And today's outline, we're going to talk about some coronavirus trends. We're going to look at how bad the second quarter is. All right. We're going to do our outlook for 2020. We're going to look at what this recovery is looking like and going to look like going forward. We're also going to take a spotlight on regional impact later in the presentation or after the presentation. Dr. Craig Depken is going to join me for questions from y'all. And the reason for that is that Craig and I have been working this past half year on a grant we've received on looking at the regional impact of the COVID-19 virus on the counties of North Carolina. So I'll do some presentation of some information, and then during question and answer, Craig will join me to highlight that information. And finally, we're going to take a look for 2020, an outlook for 2021, see how that's going. All right, so the coronavirus. A lot of you are going to look at this slide, and this is a slide that I used on March 11th in our first quarter outlook back in 9 months ago. And at that time, we had 1,205 cases total in the United States. And many of you will remember that that Friday, states started essentially shutting down or locking down businesses and activities. Schools stopped. We went virtual. Public schools did the same as well. 1,205 cases. And now we've got what? 15 million? Okay. Anyway, we've heard about the spike. This is a little bit different look. Instead of actually counting the numbers, you notice over here, I'm looking at the percentage increase. So this is the daily increase in COVID-19, in a percent daily increase in COVID-19 cases in October and November. You can see a little bit of a spike here, but you know, one of the things that's interesting, you can have increasing numbers of cases, 10 cases a day, 11 tomorrow, 12 the next day, and so on. But the percentage increase is what's really important. And what we're seeing is not a level percentage, which would produce increasing numbers of new cases, but we're actually seeing the percentage increase as well. And so we've gone from about 0.6% increase in new cases daily to now we're almost double that by the end of November at about 1.4, 1.5% new cases each day. So spike is clearly here, and it is really ramped up, and it is really starting to generate some issues that we need to deal with. Okay. So here we have, these are as of November 30th. And the reason I stopped it there was I've got a lot of data for a lot of different geographical regions. And so I thought it was best that we just freeze it at a particular day, and that was November 30th. And you can see the top 15 states, if you will, for the number of, this is ranked by just the sheer number of cases. And you can see their infection rate. And the death rate here, the infection rate is the cumulative number of people that have gotten the disease per thousand. So in the United States overall, 40 people out of every 1,000 over the last 9 months have gotten the disease. The death rate is a percentage of those cases, people who've gotten it, and the percentage that have died as a result of that. And what you can see here is clearly the most populous states, California and Texas, are leading the way. Florida, these are all pretty big states. Illinois is bigger, of course, smaller than New York, but Georgia is not a number 6 in population, but they're number 6 here. And you can see the infection rates are reflecting that. All right, what I've got here, we've got the states by infection rate, ranked by infection rate, and that's a different picture. You can see that even some of these large states, infection rates are fairly low, and in some of the smaller states, and frankly, more rural states, which is kind of wouldn't expect that have the highest infection rates. All right, now North Carolina in this is 36th in terms of the infection rate. We're below the national infection rate. And we're 36th out of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. We also have a very low death rate as well, in terms of 0.49% of cases resulting in death. And here we have essentially states ranked by death rate, and this is based on the number of cases and the number of deaths that result from those cases. And you can see that it was some of the states that were hit early on in March, before we really understood how to treat this, that had extremely high death rates, and they haven't come down that much simply because there's so many people died early on in this process. All right, on a county by county basis, what we have here is that in the state we've got 10 million cases, and we've got 1,100,000 in Mecklenburg County and almost the same number in Wake County. But these are rated essentially by that. And then over here, what we have are the counties, again, by cases per 1,000. And you can see, again, it's some of the smaller counties, less dense counties that have some of the highest case rates per 1,000. And then on death rates, what we've got here is, again, some of the more rural counties have some incredibly high death rates. The state death rate is 1.46%, but you can see right here that some of the counties are just 3, 4, 5 times that level. And in terms of the death rate, again, it has to do with treatment as opposed to virtually anything else. All right. So what did the second quarter look like? All right. So job losses by sector, and the blue is the United States and the green is North Carolina. And these are the sectors along here that what we call the North American Industrial Classification System super sectors. And you can see that the sector that was hit the most and lost half the jobs in that sector between February and April. Half the jobs were lost between February and April, and down 49.3% for the U.S. and 50% for North Carolina. For the most part, North Carolina's job losses by sector kind of mimicked the U.S. Another area was other services that had a pretty significant job loss, almost a quarter, and retail, trade, and construction. Those were all the sectors predominantly the sectors that lost jobs. Overall, we lost about 14.5% of the jobs that we had in February by April. In North Carolina, here's a count of the jobs, again, by super sector. And, excuse me, we lost a total of 615,000 jobs. Almost half of them were lost just in leisure and hospitality. And that's kind of scary, and that has some serious implications going forward. Other sectors that lost a large number of jobs, as you can see, are health and education and health services, professional and business services, and retail trade. Those are the big losers. Now, there are big employment sectors as well, so you'd expect them to lose a large number of jobs during that period of time. On a percentage basis for North Carolina, 43% of the jobs that we lost were lost just in hospitality and leisure. And you can see again here, education and health services, and business and professional services, and retail trade were the other large sectors. Most other sectors didn't lose on a percentage basis, or don't account for that big of a loss in terms of jobs in North Carolina overall. Okay, state April unemployment rates. This is a shocker, but some states had unemployment rates approaching 30%. These are states ranked in order by their April unemployment rate. And you can see that North Carolina came in at 12.9%, 25th. The US rate at that time was 14.7%. And you can see the states that had very high rates: Nevada, Michigan, Hawaii, Rhode Island. Now, interesting things. Nevada and Hawaii are obviously tourist destinations, and they lost a lot of jobs in the hospitality and leisure industry. Michigan and Rhode Island and Indiana and Ohio and Illinois are big manufacturing states, and that's where they lost their jobs. Because remember, we lost a lot of manufacturing jobs by April. Now, manufacturing jobs started to open up again by May, but hospitality and leisure sector jobs really didn't. All right. Now, looking at the US versus the North Carolina unemployment rate during this period of time, you can see that we started out, both of us at the beginning of the year, at 3.6%, and then the spike happened between February and April, when the US peaked at 14.7 and North Carolina at 12.9. Rates have been coming down fairly steadily since then. We have the November US rate at 6.7. The latest rate we have for North Carolina is October at 6.3%. I expect our rate to be about 6.2, maybe 6.1 by November or December. Okay. So, and here's a comparison of the 2007 recession, tracing the unemployment through the first basically 2 years, when it peaked at 10% in October of 2009. And what we've got here is what this recession has looked like, with this incredible spike up, as you can see, very early on, where unemployment was actually leading the recession, as opposed to the 2007-9 recession, and basically all past recessions, where unemployment was really a lagging indicator and peaked well after the GDP started to recover again. And here we're seeing, what looks like an upside down V. And this is what a lot of folks were talking about, our economists were talking about when we started to lock the economy down in March and April, that we were likely going to have a deep V recovery. And this is what that looks like, basically upside down as we're measuring the unemployment rate here. And we're back down now to 6.7%. We're basically where the 2007 to 9 recession was 9 months in, or 8 months in, 9 months in, and we're trending down, and this one was still trending up for basically another year till it peaked at 10%. Okay, now this is a chart. Just one of the things I want to make sure that we talked about this last time, and I want to make sure everybody understands this. We saw a 31.4% drop in the second quarter in US GDP. And then we saw a 33.1% increase in US GDP in the third quarter. The problem with it is that the United States is the only country in the developed world that presents their quarterly GDP in annualized numbers and in annualized growth rates. Basically what that means is they took the quarterly growth rate in GDP and raised it to the fourth power. And essentially saying, if the economy continued to grow like it did in the second quarter or in the third quarter for the next 3 quarters, the annualized growth rate would be this. So it's a little bit misleading, these two numbers. When you do it on a quarterly basis, like all of Europe does it, Asia does it, etc., you find out that we lost 9% of our GDP in the second quarter. We got back 7.4%. And what's interesting is you can see the difference here in the math, if you will, of annualized rates versus simply quarterly rates. And we didn't get it all back. Now, looking at that on a quarterly basis in terms of lost GDP compared to 2019 fourth quarter, we lost 60 billion, 61 billion in the first quarter, another 427 billion in the second quarter. That's about $500 billion. And then we gained back 320 billion, or a little more than 60% of what we lost in one quarter. So we're now sitting at about 96.5% of our GDP level in the fourth quarter, real GDP level in the fourth quarter of 2019. Cumulatively, we're on a quarterly basis down about $167 billion. Annualize that at $670 billion in terms of where we are right now in quarter 3 versus where we were in quarter 4 of 2019. Okay, North Carolina April unemployment rates, pretty significant here. Some, again, small counties, but there are some pretty large counties here that had high unemployment rates in April. The North Carolina seasonally unadjusted rate, because these are unadjusted at the county level, was 12.5% by comparison, and all these had much higher. But we've got Catawba County, which is a pretty good sized county. That's where Hickory is. Guilford County, obviously Greensboro. So those were all counties that had pretty significant unemployment rates. And then counties that had relatively low unemployment rates. Again, all of them were small counties, with the exception, the only one that's different is Orange County, which is where Chapel Hill is, and it's part of the Durham Chapel Hill MSA. That was the only significant county or size county that had low unemployment rate in April of 2020. As far as the MSAs are concerned, again, pretty much what you'd expect, simply because of Catawba County, Hickory, Lenore, Morganton MSA had a very high unemployment rate. Most of the rest of them, a lot of them were lower, the smaller ones. The bigger ones, as you can see, all had essentially rates above the state average, the only exception being Raleigh, where there's a lot of government jobs. North Carolina in 2020. So what happened? What's happening here? All right, first of all, we didn't drop quite as much as the US did in the second quarter, and we didn't come back quite as strong in the third quarter. So this is compared to 31%, 0.7% and 33% in growth in the third quarter. We're lost 30.5% annualized, came back 27.0% annualized. Looks like the fourth quarter is going to be about 5.6% growth. So overall, from the fourth quarter to the fourth quarter, GDP is down by about 3.4%. in 2020 on average for the year versus on average for 2019. On a sector by sector basis, virtually all of the non-agricultural sectors, except for mining, showed declines, and some of them were pretty significant. And you can see here, the big sector decline was in health and hospitality and leisure services, and other services at 33.9 and at 10%. But we also saw a big drop in durable goods in 2020. Not so much in non-durables, but durables, big ticket item purchases, investment goods, and stuff like that really were off quite a bit. As far as jobs are concerned, the bad news is that by December of 2020, this month, when the numbers come out, we'll have lost 224,100 jobs. That's a job decline of 4.8% compared to December of 2019. Again, you can see the big job decline, 17.3% in hospitality and leisure services. Now, remember, they lost 40%, 50% of their jobs in between February and April. Overall, at the end of the year, they're down 17% from December of 2019. So there's still a considerable number of jobs still empty, if you will, in the hospitality and leisure services. Businesses and professional services and educational health services and government are the other ones that are substantially and have lost substantial jobs. And what's important here is if you look at this, this graph provides information, kind of ties together growth rates, which are on the horizontal axis, in this case, losses, and then pie chart information on the vertical axis, percent of the total jobs that each sector represents. So the area of each sector's rectangle gives you a sense as to how important it was to the overall job losses. And you can see here that 4 sectors, business and professional services, education and health, hospitality and leisure, and government, they basically accounted for most of the job losses this year. All right, so looking forward, what's the recovery going to look like? All right, so this is a job tracking, if you will. And this is only through October, because that's that's the most recent number we have for the North Carolina. For US, there were a few jobs created in November, but not very many. That was a fairly low job month. So this number doesn't change by very much. It was less than 200,000 jobs. We lost between February and April 22 million jobs, 615,000 in North Carolina. We've had some big spike backs, particularly in June in both the US and in North Carolina, and then fairly stable growth through July, August, September, and October, both the US and North Carolina. So far, the May through October count, that's this 6-month count here of job growth, has produced about 12 million jobs and 350 million here. And what you get out of that is about 55, 56% of the jobs have been gained back that we lost. So we've got about a little more than half the jobs back. There's not a big difference between what's going on in the US and what's happening in North Carolina. We're sort of in the middle of this. Okay, this is, again, I just want to throw these out to you. This is these shaded sections on this. So this is the 1990 recession, and it's kind of the employment pattern here. North Carolina didn't do as bad as the US, and you can see how long it took to get back to the level that was 4.5 years basically to get back to the level that we entered in terms of the unemployment rate. And yet the recession only lasted, as you can see, 8 months. Okay, and you can see that the unemployment's peaked well after the end of the recession. And that's the end of the recession is signaling us as to when GDP starts growing again. Do the same thing for the 2001 recession. It peaked, jobs peaked a little bit sooner nationally, a little later here. But again, we're looking at an employment duration of about 5.5 years to get back to the rates in which we entered this recession in. And then we look, going ahead, there we go. So in this one, as I've said, we've seen this peak and we've seen this slide before, but I just want to make it clear that we're coming back rapidly. If you just extend this out, it's going to be sometime probably in late 2021 when we start to get back below 5% again. All right, so This is just kind of a cumulative chart of all of that. It's the months that it took to reach the peak unemployment rate. You can see how different this recession is. It basically usually took 2 years, even though the recessions weren't that long. It took 2 years or more to get to the peak rate. Here's the peak rates. And as you can see, we're getting pretty close to getting down close to that 5% range. All right, so take a look at this regional impact of what's been happening in North Carolina. So this is the October employment or the October unemployment seasonally adjusted rates by state. And these are the states that have incredibly low unemployment rates. We're at 6.3%, remember, but Nebraska's at 3%. And if you look at all of these 10 states, basically, what recession? They're done with it. They're done with it. They have unemployment rates that are below 5%, and 8 of them have unemployment rates below 4.5%. A couple of them are our neighbors, Georgia and South Carolina, but so does New Hampshire, so does Utah. So they have very low unemployment rates. And for a number of states, the recession is essentially over. All right, now we've got some other states that had very high rates. These are ranked basically the April rate and how bad it was. And you can see how slow they've been to recover. Michigan's done fairly well. They're down to 5.5%. But again, Michigan and Rhode Island had peak rates primarily because in Indiana and Ohio, because of manufacturing shut down in the short term and in April. But those opened up again in total, and their rates have gone down considerably. But the 2 states that rely heavily on travel and tourism still have very, very high unemployment rates. For the seasonally unadjusted rates in North Carolina on a county by county basis, these are the counties that have unemployment rates below 5% already. And that is October for these counties. So we don't have the November numbers for the North Carolina counties again. And you can see that Watauga County, which is where Boone is, and Orange County, again, Chapel Hill, lead the pack with rates that are, you would have to argue, are pretty close to full employment rates. The rest of these are fairly small counties, generally speaking, but again, they all have essentially recovered. Their economies are back where they were, or pretty close to where they were back in the fourth quarter of 2019. On the other hand, we still have a number of counties. Again, these are ranked by where their unemployment rate is in October, and this is their April unemployment rate. So, but that still have surprisingly high unemployment rates. In this case, Scotland County and Edgecombe County are basically double what we would consider to be the natural rate of unemployment or the benchmark rate of unemployment, around 5%. So we've got a lot of counties spread throughout the state that are still struggling going forward on this. All right, this is a chart that take a few minutes to explain, but I think it will show you, hopefully you'll understand the disparity of this recession amongst the counties in North Carolina. So what we did here was we took the April unemployment rate and we broke them into quintiles. That's groups of 20 counties each, or 100 counties in North Carolina. So we took the 20 counties with the highest unemployment, we put them in quintile 5, and the 20 counties with the lowest unemployment rates in April, we put them in quintile 1. And then we did the average of the unemployment rate for the quintiles. What you see here is a vast difference in terms of the counties that were most impacted on average by the COVID-19 lockdowns, where the unemployment rate on average for those 20 worst counties was 11.5%. And you can see it's more than double what the average was for the 20 counties that performed the best. And while we've seen a collapsing of the differences, we still see significant differences here, where in September, or excuse me, try that one more time. In October, there's still, and by the way, this is, I failed to mention, this is the increasing unemployment rate between April of 2019 and April of 2020. The actual level of unemployment rates, because they're seasonally unadjusted, is a little difficult to make those comparisons. So the 20 worst counties had an unemployment rate 11.5 percentage points higher than their April 2019 rate. And here's the 20 least affected counties. But you can still see they're almost 4% higher 4 percentage points higher today than they were a year ago. And they're still, even the best counties are about 2.2 percentage points higher. Sales tax collections, same kind of thing. We split them into quintiles, and these are their sales tax collections compared to the same month a year earlier. And you can see that, you know, in May, everybody's sales tax collections went down, but in the counties that were least affected, they were still collecting more sales tax in May of 2020 than they did in May of 2019. All right. The other 80 counties were collecting less. The middle two quintiles, not so bad. The bottom quintiles were suffering 10 and 15% on average decreases in their sales tax collections in May versus what they collected in 2019. And now they're getting some of that back. And if you look at the areas on these curves, we're getting a lot of that back. But the top three counties basically were made whole in June and July and August. But the bottom two quintiles, the top three quintiles were made whole. The bottom two quintiles really suffered dramatically during the year in terms of sales tax collections. All right, these are the October MSA unemployment rates, and you can see that overall the state rate is 6.1%, and so all but all but Greensboro, Rocky Mount, Fayetteville were at least at the rate that the state was, or a little bit lower than that. Okay, and with Chapel Hill, Durham Chapel Hill being the lowest, along with Raleigh and Wilmington. Okay, outlook for that should be 2021, I think. All right, the deep V, we've heard talk about that. We showed you kind of an indication of that with the unemployment rate, but a lot of people are talking about the dreaded K recovery, where some of the economy goes up, but a lot of the economy still suffers and is still on the way down. Ultimately, consumer confidence will decide whether we have a V recovery or a K recovery. All right, so the K recovery, what are we talking about here? That's where some of the economy does well, all right, and some of the economy does not do well. So what I'm looking at here is employment levels by super sector, all right, classification. We're looking at their October level versus their February level, okay? So what we're seeing here is, you know, remember jobs started declining in March and April, all right? And of course, the big job loss was in April, but we've been gaining jobs back since then. We're still 265,000 jobs short of our February number in October, but you can see here, most of the sectors are pretty darn close back, but there's only a couple of sectors, manufacturing, and that's all on the durable goods side. But the big one here, almost half the jobs, 45% remaining job losses, are in hospitality or leisure and hospitality services. On a percentage basis, if we look at that, you can see that virtually every sector is, except for hospitality and leisure, has gained back over 90%, and most have gained back 95% of the jobs that they lost. It is really right here, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more, but this is the essence of the K recovery. It's what's going on in leisure and hospitality, and to a lesser extent in durable goods manufacturing, where those sectors simply aren't coming back, but a lot of the rest of the economy is coming back. Not there yet. Financial activities, it says 100%, but honestly, they're down 200 jobs from where they were in February. Okay, so consumer confidence is going to decide the day, if you will. The good news is, after several months where consumer confidence has been down because of the coronavirus, all right, it's starting to show an increase, and we're now up to 96% or 96 an index number, and that's pretty good news. That the consumers are starting to feel better. We'll be interested to see what happens in November with that COVID spike that we've seen. So the North Carolina economy in 2021. All right. Annual growth rate for the year is going to be 4.5%. Remember, we ended the year with a little over 5% in the fourth quarter of 2020, and we're starting to see the economy's growth start to trail off here. First quarter 4.8%, but by the fourth quarter, we'll be back to that 3.6%. And for 2022, we're probably back in the 2.5% range as this thing winds its way through. All right, on a sector by sector basis, every sector is going to show growth. Biggest growth that we'll see in 2021 are going to be hospitality and leisure and educational health services as they, increase. And this is all predicated, by the way, on vaccine being disseminated in the first and second quarter of 2021, and lockdowns basically going away by the second quarter of 2021 across the country. Net jobs, we're going to add 245,000. Now, if you remember, we lost 200 and something thousand, 220 something thousand in 2020. So we're actually going to be, our job level employment at the end of December, or in December of 2021, will actually be higher than it was in December of 2019. All right, so we're going to see about a 5.4% growth rate in jobs this year. Again, hospitality and leisure services should get back most of their jobs during 2020, by the end of 2021. As far as unemployment is concerned, right now we're sitting at 6.3%. We expect the year to end at about 6.1%. And I think we'll get down about 5.1% by the end of 2021. We'll be really nudging close to full employment by the end of 2021. What can we expect? Okay, so there are some interesting things going on here. There are demand side impacts. In other words, consumers responding to COVID-19, and there are some supply side impacts. So on the demand side, as I said, consumer confidence. I cannot emphasize this enough. We've got the COVID-19 spike that's taking place, has been taking place now for the last month and a half. We have the vaccines on the horizon. We've already started to see vaccines being disseminated in the UK, also in the UAE, and Canada is has approved them and expected to start either tomorrow or Monday in terms of starting to issue vaccines. Our FDA is meeting today, most likely will approve emergency use, and probably by sometime next week, we'll start to see vaccines starting to be administered. And so we've got these two countervailing forces here, and how that affects consumer confidence. Because remember, what we're looking at here is really consumers' willingness in the first and second quarter of 2021 to go back and do things that they've deemed uncomfortable during all of 2020. In other words, become in social contact with people that they do not live with. And we don't know how effective or how motivated consumers are going to be to go back to what it was back in 2019. It remains to be seen, but that ultimately will drive the strength of the recovery in 2021 and again going forward in 2022. We also have industries at long-term risk. Consumers have changed their buying patterns, and we really do not know what's going to happen when this virus ends in terms of what people are going to go back to what they used to do, or are they going to go ahead and go forward with a new model of consumer preferences. These are things we don't know, and it'll be interesting to see, and it'll be a lot of research done on the effect that COVID had on consumer choices going forward. On the supply side, we've had some serious supply chain shortages. We've had business failures, particularly in the leisure and hospitality industry. And we've had industry bailouts. And going forward, we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's unclear as to how effective those have been. And the last thing I'll talk about is accelerated consumer trends, and that's online versus brick and mortar businesses, and the acceleration of people going online versus brick and mortar. But I have a feeling that when this is all over, by the second quarter, people are actually going to stroll on back to the mall, maybe. Industries at risk: cruise ships, airlines, intercity transportation. Again, these are all environments where people are in close contact with people they do not live with, and how effective or how motivated people are going to be going forward to engage in these businesses. Same thing with the hospitality industry: conference hotels, resort destinations, restaurants, etc. Again, how people will respond to winding down, if you will, of COVID-19 as a health problem. What we expect at the end of 2021 is that GDP will be 1.4% higher than it was in 2019 fourth quarter. We'll have 21,000 more jobs than we did in December of 2019. And the unemployment rate will still be a little bit higher than it was but all things are pointing for this to go down in 2022 as well. All right, last thing we're going to talk about real quick, should Congress do another stimulus? We all know about the 2.7 trillion in stimulus that was passed back in April and May, and some of it was pretty good. Now, if you remember, we only lost about $600 billion worth of GDP in that period, but yet we authorized $2.6 trillion to compensate for that. Just an observation on the side. We still haven't spent about 540 billion of this 2.6 trillion, 2.7 trillion. In addition to that, the Fed had 700 billion in quantitative easing. So we had the 560 billion left over, and 554 billion of federal loan backstops that haven't been used yet. So we still got, if you will, a kitty of over $1 trillion that can be used. Now, we've heard about the bipartisan bill out of the Senate, and this is just kind of a look at what's included in that. And you can see these are the big ones here: additional unemployment insurance, 180 billion, and support for small business payroll protection again at 228 billion. That makes up roughly half, a little less than half of the total. The rest of it is all pretty small, but it's 908 billion. But you know, we keep hearing and hearing and hearing, but we don't seem to be having anything come out of that. Okay, so keys to watch going forward. Let's see how I'm doing the time. Well, I'm only 2 minutes over. Pretty good for an economist. The COVID-19 spike and lockdowns and what effects that's going to have in the very near term over the next month to month and a half. Vaccine approval and dissemination. By the end of the day, we should have some pretty solid idea about what's going to happen there. Whether or not we'll have a second round of stimulus. Most economists agree that a very small targeted stimulus, mainly at payroll protection and unemployment. And by the way, that unemployment increase is $300 a week as opposed to the previous $600 a week. If that comes about, that will probably speed up the recovery in 2021. Consumer confidence, we always need to keep track of that. That really will depend or determine how fast the economy recovers, particularly the leisure and hospitality industry. The U.S. monthly job growth will come out the first Friday of every month. Everybody should have their alert set to pick that up. The next Federal Open Market Committee, although I don't know what they can do, the interest rates are already at zero. But finally, the fourth quarter GDP number, January 28th. It'll be interesting to see. A lot of economists before the spike were suspecting that nationally we could have a 7, 8, even 9% GDP growth rate in the fourth quarter. It's looking, with this lockdown, a number of states really putting on severe lockdowns, it's looking as if that probably won't happen, but we will know at the end of January how we did in the fourth quarter. So overall, going to go ahead and stop my presentation now, and we're going to, I guess, pick up Craig, and we're going to start to answer some questions. So invite back Jennifer and Craig for the question and answer period.
So thank you, John. You know, as you said, we're going to move over to the Q&A portion. We have several questions we've received so far. As a reminder, all of you can submit your questions into the chat function, and we're going to stay a little late today, so we'll try to answer as many of those as possible. So I also want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Craig Depken. So he is a professor of economics in the Belk College, and he's going to be offering some of his expertise during the Q&A. As John mentioned, they've been working together on some research around the impact of COVID-19 on different counties in the state. So, all right, so let's go ahead and take it away with the first question. So John, the first question is really, what business clusters and sectors do you think will recover first? You know, do you or most strongly? I mean, I think, do you believe there's some pent-up demand for travel and vacations? Again,
this is the one that, okay. We had a slide earlier that showed the percentage job growth gain back, and most of the sectors were at 90 to 95%, with the exception of hospitality and leisure. That's really the leg, if you will, in the K recovery pattern, hospitality and leisure. And what remains to be seen, and it's unknown to anybody right now, is how people are going to respond once we get to a point where we're close to, or even get to herd immunity, which means roughly always at 60-65% of the population either is vaccinated or has had the disease. And we don't know how people are going to respond. This has been such a, we heard back in 2007, 8, 9 recession, people started talking about the new normal. We're going to really have a new normal going forward, and we don't know what it's going to look like in terms of how consumers are going to behave. And the reason for that is that this has been traumatic. It's been 9 months so far, and it's really going to be 12 months before we're going to be able to get back on the street again. And it's changed our patterns. It's forced us into doing things that we didn't do before, into buying things we didn't buy before. Now, obviously, I'm going to stop buying hand sanitizer. I'm hoping that by June or July, I'm going to be able to get rid of my masks. But with the exception of those things, we've done more online shopping, and I'm sure everybody has. Most people before this did not shop for groceries online. A lot of people are now shopping for groceries online. So there's a lot of differences in terms of the way people shop and the kinds of things they do. And it's unclear what that's going to look like going forward after we get herd immunity, how people are going to respond to being able to go back the way they were, or are they going to keep and hang on to some of the things that they do now?
So, sort of related to that, we in Charlotte, we have a good size hospitality and leisure sector, right? So, I think that one question that a lot of folks have is sort of what sort of damage can that sector take, and then still be able to rebound relatively quickly.
To be quite frank, without another payroll protection without another stimulus package that has some payroll protection in it, it's going to be difficult for sure. I mean, it's interesting. We've had a lot of stop orders, if you will. You can't, if you're not paying your rent, you can't get evicted and so on. But that stuff accumulates. It's going to have to get paid sooner or later. And if there's not another round of stimulus, it doesn't have to be 2.7. 900 billion is probably even too much. But if there's not another round of stimulus to help these businesses stay afloat, the airline industries, convention centers, we've seen what's going on in Nevada and Hawaii in terms of the effect there on their hospitality and leisure industries. If there's not another round of, because this isn't going to happen, those businesses aren't going to be up and running in the first quarter of next year. And that's not going to happen. Best case is it's summer. But then you've got the problem of how many businesses are going to, particularly for a place like Charlotte, which is not a tourist destination, but it's a business conferencing destination. How many businesses are going to be willing to fund travel for their workers, knowing they may be on the hook if something bad goes wrong? So it's unclear as to how well they will recover and how many restaurants are left to open up in April or May.
Yeah. Okay, so this next question to Craig, Dr. Depken. So can you talk to us a little bit about what your research is showing in terms of what regions of North Carolina have been most affected and least affected by the government shutdowns and COVID-19?
Sure. So we've been doing some preliminary analysis, mainly looking at the unemployment rates and also the sales tax revenues. I think those two metrics are the ones that kind of get to the heart of what's going on, without going down to the most granular individual level. So every region, if we think about the prosperity zones that have been set up here in the state of North Carolina, each prosperity zone suffered increases in unemployment, and most of the zones suffered a reduction in the sales tax revenue. The two that were most hardest hit were the Western region, which is, I guess, centered around Asheville, and then the Piedmont Triad region, centered around Greensboro. And so those two stood out as the bundle of counties that have suffered most in terms of the unemployment. The research moving forward is to delve into these individual counties themselves. And I think I mentioned in the chat room that what's interesting in the two charts that Dr. Connaughton showed with the quintiles is that the composition of the counties that make up the quintiles for the unemployment rate differ from the composition of the quintiles for the sales tax changes. So you would think that if, like, say, a county was doing really well with unemployment, they might be doing really well with sales tax revenue, because maybe that means that there's not a lot of slowdown of economic activity. We're not seeing that. I think that's a very interesting problem to crack. Like, what's going on? Is it the composition of the underlying industries, right? What is it? Which sectors are that these counties more relying on? So we are seeing differences, and it does seem to be like the West is the hardest hit. And then again, maybe not be surprising given the rural nature of that area. And again, it was brought up, I believe, in one of the chat room questions as well. One of the other aspects that I'm interested in personally is kind of what's been the impact of the UNC system and the system schools being allocated across the state, and what impact that had on both unemployment, but also on the sales tax as a proxy of economic activity. So, we're here in Mecklenburg County. I live in Cabarrus County, and so, does that mean that there's a difference between these two counties, or does Cabarrus get a benefit because it's a border county with Mecklenburg? If I went out to look at UNC Asheville, right, would it be that Buncombe County is less impacted by the COVID, but then a border county might have suffered more, or at least another county nearby that doesn't have a UNC system school. So I think that's a good question for us to be asking in the next 2 or 3 months. Again, one thing about economic research, as my colleagues know, but maybe most other people don't, is that the data don't come to us very quickly. We're getting slightly better at that, but the data are always lagged 1 or 2 or 3 months, sometimes even a year. So for us to be able to kind of boots on the ground, doing real-time analysis, we're doing the best we can at the moment, I think, but we'll have much better information, at the end of Q1 of 2021.
Great. Thanks, Craig. So a related question that popped up. So, we saw that Orange County's unemployment wasn't affected very much. And, the question, it was really the question that was submitted was, does this have something to do with the fact that, there are lots of UNC system employees there that didn't lose their jobs? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of where I'm thinking that the next step of our research would go. It's not just looking at UNC system schools, although from my perspective as a UNC system employee, that's helpful, right? But also thinking about, there are other major universities, or both the private universities that are at different levels, say at Duke, Wake Forest, and Elon, so on. So, does a High Point University, does that have an impact? So relying upon a higher education institution, that's been a question for quite some time. What is the value of having those institutions around? In good times, I think the college, or having a college in your area is a helpful thing, right? It draws people in for athletic events or cultural events. Of course, the students are there. The faculty have fairly steady employment. They typically live nearby. So all that's really good in good times. I think now with the pandemic and the fact that, most students are not on campus, this is now a bigger problem. So yes, I think in the unemployment issue, maybe having a system school is very good. But in terms of the sales tax revenue, maybe that's where things are going to be worse, because there's students aren't around. You can see I'm in my office on campus, but there's nobody here. Typically I'll go with colleagues for lunch. And so all the restaurants around UNC Charlotte, they're not getting my dollar. So that was coming up to what John was saying earlier, is that not only is it patterns of, attendance at higher education or sporting events, but it's going to be, what's going on with work. Center City, Charlotte is full of high-rise buildings that I'm sure are empty or nearly empty. And the question is, what's going to happen moving forward? We had seen a short-run version of what happened with the restaurants in the Center City area during the DNC convention a few years ago, where restaurants that were in the green zone were basically shut down because the employees weren't allowed to go to work. And so the Quiznos and those type of, lunchery eateries, they were suffering dramatically. Meanwhile, the Capitol Grill is doing great, because that was maybe a unique experience for people that were going to the DNC convention. So we've seen a short run version of that, and it did impact their revenues dramatically. Now, of course, it's only a week and a half, so I think most of them could recover, but we're looking at a 9, 12, 18-month version of this, or moving forward, if people don't go to work in the same numbers, then the restaurant business could be, looking at kind of a longer term adjustment into a new equilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to shift the discussion a little bit to interest rates and the Fed. So, John, so, where do you see long-term interest rates going? How might that affect, in particular, residential and commercial construction? And then, are we worried about inflation?
Well, yeah, I wish we were worried about inflation. That would be a good thing right now. But right now, from what we can gather, the Fed is pretty much committed to at least another year or two of essentially zero rates of interest. And while they only really can impact the federal funds rate, that's their target, which is the rate that banks pay to borrow from other banks. That kind of sets the floor for every other interest rate that's out there. And we're seeing incredibly low rates on, 10-year bonds, on 2-year notes, et cetera. Really, incredibly low rates, historically low rates. But it's also, because of this, it's also dragged down long-term rates. So it's not uncommon now to get a 30-year fixed rate mortgage well below 3%. Now, on the one hand, you'd think that would drive the building industry, but it doesn't seem to be. I mean, that is the one part of this recession that has been so different than any other recession, and that is one of the sectors that's going crazy is homes. Home prices in metropolitan areas are going off the rails. And those of us who live in Charlotte or Raleigh know that very well, as we've seen housing prices appreciate more this year than virtually any other year in the last 20. Let me get back to what the question you asked. But mortgage rates are very low, and you would think that between the two, that would drive housing demand, and it seems to be driving it, but it's not driving housing supply for reasons that I don't fully understand right now. I don't understand why supply is not keeping up. But nevertheless, we're seeing that take place. But as far as interest rates are concerned, I don't, if I were advising somebody right now that has a home mortgage that's anywhere north of 3.5%, there's a window to get in and lower your mortgage and your monthly payment considerably. You don't need to hustle out and do it between now and Christmas. You can wait till after the first of the year. Quite frankly, you can probably wait till the second quarter before we start to see any kind of rise in rates. Everybody needs to understand we're getting a vaccine, but that's not going to change things very much until late second quarter. Got to get enough people vaccinated. And we've already heard, folks that know doctors, Fauci, say that even after you get the vaccine, we're still going to have mask requirements through at least the middle of 2021. And that has a psychological effect on how people behave.
Yeah, I would just back that up with just the idea that, again, the long-term interest rates typically reflect what we call the real interest rate. That is what the investors need, kind of the reward for their investment and for their foregoing of current consumption. And then the expected inflation rate, right? Those combine to create what we call the nominal interest rate, which is what you see on your mortgage. So when real interest rates are down a little bit, I mean, they're not going to be negative, we don't think, but they're going to be down a little bit. When we see the nominal rates being so low and persistently low, that says that the market does not anticipate inflation in that, whatever you want to call that, kind of mid to longer term. I think the one concern that I have as an economist is that typically the inflation that harms the most is the one that is not anticipated, or at least it's the one that shows up without being indicated in the markets. So we'd like to think that markets are efficient, and we do think they are. So I'm more of an inflation hedge, because I'm worried that the inflation is going to come and we're not going to see it. It's going to happen very quickly. Alternatively, there is the suggestion that the inflation that we're seeing is not on the consumer side, but is on the investment side in terms of assets. And partly that could help explain why the stock market seems to be doing the opposite of what we think in a cratered economy, and one that's slowly recovering. So that, again, that's kind of I would back up what John was saying, but I think this is another thing to be concerned about, is that just because you see low interest rates doesn't mean there couldn't be inflation.
Got it. So, the governor just announced some modified shutdowns, right? Some additional modified shutdowns in terms of, the 10 o'clock curfew and so on. And then we've got, school systems that are, moving online. What do you think that those things in particular will have any sort of significant impact or that will be moving towards more shutting down in the near future?
Yeah, I think that, as I mentioned in the presentation, that before this ramp up, the spike that we've seen in October and November, many economists were suspecting that we would see a 7, 8, maybe even a 9% GDP growth rate in the fourth quarter. I think we're pretty certain now that in the last month of this quarter, we're seeing the same kind of thing we saw in the last month of March that kind of dragged down the first quarter of 2020. So I don't think we're going to see. I think we're going to see a modest growth rate, 5-6%, something like that in the fourth quarter. Most of which will have been gotten in October and November, because we are going in. As much as we've seen an impact in terms of North Carolina. Remember, we're not at the top of this spike. Yeah, it's spiking in North Carolina, but we're still way, way down in terms of infection rates compared to a lot of other states. If you're in California or any other number of states, this spike is serious and real. And so the lockdowns there are much more severe than they are here. And they are going to have an effect on GDP in the fourth quarter. There's no question. And depending on how long this spike, and nobody knows how long it will last. We don't know. It could affect the first quarter as well. Now, second quarter, nothing. But as I said at the close of my presentation, because of this spike, sitting around debating $10 billion here and $20 billion there about the second stimulus package is really kind of selfish. And I don't speak very often about politics, Jennifer, you know that. But as an economist, we need a second stimulus package to keep this economy moving through the first quarter of 2021.
Yeah, I would just back that up with I think the lockdowns themselves have the direct effect of obviously slowing down economic activity. To what extent, that we'll see that in the data in the coming months. I think the bigger concern is that uncertainty kind of writ large is also a dampening effect on economic activity, especially investment, entrepreneurship. And so as lockdowns become a little more, so yes, the governor did what he had to do, but what I would say that the restrictions keep changing. Basically, they're changing with whatever's happening with the pandemic at the time. So, but that's kind of baking in the cake, at least for the past 9 months, is a lot of uncertainty. So you could say, so for the past month, my kids have been going to school, great. Now, starting next week, no longer going to school. So that introduces a level of uncertainty that, now can parents really plan for 2 or 3 or 4 months in the future? If your parents can't, if parents can't plan, then how am I going to plan to open a business that would require, significant investment, construction? So I think that's the bigger concern I have moving forward, is that you're creating a level of uncertainty that has another second order effect on economic activity, in addition to the direct effect of the shutdown itself.
Got it. So, John, you talked about stimulus packages. So I'm just one quick question on that. Are there items that you think would give us, the biggest bang for our buck in terms of?
Yeah, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to a slide. I hope. Hopefully, everybody can see that slide.
Yep.
That's the $908 billion. Honestly, the two most important are these two right here. $180 billion for additional unemployment insurance. That's $300 a week on top of what the state pays. That doesn't do you any good for extended unemployment benefits, and we may need to look into that. And the second one is payroll protection and support for small businesses. Those are the two most important areas that need to get funded. We also need some money for state and local governments. That's probably more than they need in terms of meeting the crisis, for some of the support, if you will, a social floor, if you will. But these are the two most important ones. I'm not complaining about the rest. They're not big numbers here. But this is what needs to happen right now to compensate people who lose their jobs and businesses who lose customers because of the shutdown, the lockdowns that are being put in place. This is what we need to overcome. Do not underestimate the impact that these two programs had back in April and May in terms of allowing June, July, and August to look like they did when the lockdowns were eased. So that's really where we need to be looking at.
Thank you. So, You mentioned online grocery shopping. I think that there's been speculation about whether that's a trend that will continue. Certainly, that was a trend that had started pre-pandemic. Are there any sort of other trends that were that might be accelerated because of the pandemic?
Yeah, if you look at a lot of, we got DoorDash doing an IPO today. I mean, that's a great example. I mean, all of a sudden, you take a company that's never made any money, and they're doubling their IPO initial offering now. So again, this has really changed the way people. Yeah, this is personal and it may not hold for everybody, but I'm probably never going to go back into a hardware store again. It's just a lot easier to click and have it delivered in a day or two, and put the chore off. And same thing with food shopping. I mean, it's not that, it's what is it, $5-7 and a little tip, and you didn't give up an hour of your life plus hassles in the parking lot. So a lot of people are going to look at that, and they're going to change their behavior. It probably more directed toward malls, but I'll tell you another area where we're going to see some changes, and that is in the workplace. The studies that I've seen done on work suggest that people who are working online, now again, this is for people who can work online, not everybody can, are working more hours and are more productive than they were when they were in their office. Now, I don't think we're going to go to 100% online working, but I think that we're going to see a kind of a hybrid model going forward, where companies are going to start to test out, well, maybe 2 days a week you come in the office, we do some brainstorming, and then once a month everybody comes on in, and we have meetings and stuff like that. But yet, now I will say this, it's been easy, this is personal again, it's been easy for me to work more during this pandemic because I had nothing else I can do. And so, coming up in my office every day at 8 o'clock has been relatively easy. Otherwise, I don't think I can watch another, the fifth time, the same episode of Law and Order.
Got it.
Yeah, there are going to be some changes.
So, yeah, sort of related to that, I mean, I think this issue of telework is very interesting. We know that we've seen, women dropping out of the labor force during this pandemic at a greater rate than men, and then other subgroups obviously being impacted differently as well. Telework may be something that could potentially help pull women back into the labor force a little bit quicker. But I don't know if you've got any thoughts on implications for different subgroups.
Yeah, I think in the case of, I will simply say that my daughter-in-law left work in March because they have a small child, a second grader, and they had to effectively homeschool them. And they thought that was important, and they just made that decision. And so she got unemployed, but she really wasn't. She's not technically classified as unemployed. She's left the labor force. The thing going forward, though, is a lot of women left the labor force for exactly that reason, because schools shut down. If we get the schools back up and running, which I'm pretty sure, despite the spike, we're going to start to see in January and February, we're going to start to see that. And I think it's Craig mentioned earlier, there's a certain degree of certainty in that it's not going to change going forward. Then you'll start to see women start to re-enter the labor force. They'll have that opportunity to do that. But this is, for a lot of young families now, this has really thrown a monkey wrench into their planning. They never expected, nobody ever saw this coming. And it has been very disruptive for a number of families. And when I say number, I'm talking millions of families.
Okay, they've been great questions. Thank you for responding. We just have time for one more, and that's really a question about the transportation sector. There have been questions about how this will impact, especially our public bus and rail system, and which obviously has some implications, given that there's discussion around trying to get a sales tax increase in Charlotte for more rail. So do you have any sense of how public busing and rail and subways and so on have been impacted, and any implications for Charlotte?
as I said earlier, a lot of the recovery in 2021 is really going to depend on how individuals recover from the trauma of this event. We historically we're very social people, not just the United States, but all throughout the world. And being close to people is part of who we are. And going forward, during this pandemic, that you didn't want to be on a subway or a bus. A lot of people had to commute. Now we're commuting using their own personal transportation, and ridership is off considerably, primarily because in big cities that have a lot of public transportation, because people weren't going downtown anymore because they were all telecommuting, but also those who were not telecommuting and had to work downtown, they were essentially driving their cars. It was easier for them to drive them and find parking spaces. Going forward, this is the big question, whether it's public transportation, airplanes, cruise ships, how comfortable after a year of social distancing and concern by lots of people, how comfortable are people going to be going forward, mixing with people again, hugging them, high-fiving them, that kind of thing, not wearing a mask, smiling at folks, hugging and kissing, long lost acquaintances when you see them. We don't know what that's going to look like, because this thing can always come back. Even when we've got 65, 70% vaccinated and immune, it can always come back.
Well, this has been really enlightening. So thank you, Dr. Connaughton. Thank you, Dr. Depken. And thanks to all of you for joining us for the Barings UNC Charlotte Economic Forecast. So we'd ask that you go ahead and save the date for the next economic forecast. So we'll be back together on Friday, March 5th. If you're interested in learning more about sponsorship opportunities for the economic forecast, please reach out to us, email us at belkrsvp@uncc.edu. So this concludes our program today. Please stay safe and well.